The Lumix S1RII is here. First and foremost, the S1RII uses a brand new 8K sensor, and it looks like it's the first camera to use the sensor.
Of course, that is just the tip of the iceberg.
Internal recording in ProRes RAW or ProRes, that is in 8K open gate. Excellent low light performance. The new image stabilization is unbelievably good. Improved dynamic range, 120 frames per second in 4K from a full frame readout, internal 32-bit float, and so much more. Things that make a filmmaker's heart beat faster, and I'm sure it's a great photo camera too. We're going to test the capabilities of the S1RII with a little short film, pitch it directly against the S5IIX, and we're going to take you along to the Artic Circle to test the camera under extreme conditions.
If you have been around on this channel, you know that I'm not that easily impressed, and I just had the camera for a brief time. But the S1RII fills about every gap and open wish I had when using the S5IIX. This might be very well the best creator camera on the market right now, especially as Panasonic managed to squeeze all those delicious features into the same form factor as the S5II. Let's give you a quick tour around the camera and its most important features.
Like mentioned, the S1IIR sports a new dual gain sensor with 44 megapixels. Panasonic claims 13 stops of dynamic range with an additional stop when the extended dynamic range feature is activated. Of course, it has the versatile L-mount, and the wide opening makes the new improved IBIS and dual IS system possible without any cropping or vignetting. Dual CF Express and SD card slots give you a speedy and an economic choice. A tilt and free angle LCD lets you do about everything. Separate photo and video modes, 5 custom modes on the mode wheel, a new mechanical shutter made from carbon, 40 frames per second burst rate for photos. Besides the usual flavors of 422H.264 and 420H.265, it can record ProRes up to 422HQ internally, in open gate at full resolution, or sample down to 6K, 4K or Full HD. Of course, full vlog is built in. You can also record ProRes RAW up to HQ internally, in open gate at full resolution or with a variety of crops. Like the GH7, it can record 30-bit float audio internally, but it needs the optional XLR2 adapter for that. 2 new apps help with the workflow, and live streaming, wired and wireless like the S5IIX.
If you're a Lumix user, you will feel right at home when you have the S1RII in your hand. Actually, the body is so similar to the S5IIX that we were able to put it into a cage made for that camera. All that tech comes at a price, and the S1RII costs $3,299 at launch. By no means what I would call cheap, but very competitive when you look at the offerings from the other usual suspects. And the specs make the S1RII easily a contender for the throne. Of course, the camera is weather sealed, which will come in handy at the Artic Circle, where we had our first encounter with the S1RII. So come and join us on our little adventure.
A couple of weeks ago, Panasonic called me and said that they had a new camera release coming up, and if I wanted to do a hands-on, I would have to come to Tromsø, that is way up north in Norway. After a flight through the long winter night and the snowy mountaintop of Valhalla, I arrived in Tromsø. Looking at this frozen serenity of a town, I do question the wisdom of the Vikings settling here without central heating. The scenery here has so little contrast that we called it natural log. By the way, this is Luca, a fellow creator, and we did some of our exploring together, so when you see me doing some of my shenanigans, it's usually him filming me. Thank you, Luca. He will have his own review out and talk a lot more about photography than me, so I'll link his review in the corner. Check it out. Of course, we were not the only ones up here. Panasonic invited quite a few creators from around the world to check out the new S1RII. We met camera review royalty like Tony Northrup, Chris and Jordan from Petapixel, and many other familiar faces from YouTube and beyond. a whole bunch of nerds. That includes me, of course. Together we froze off our fingers and other important body parts. We had reindeers pee on our boots, filmed creators filming creators, hunted for auroras, and feasted on Norwegian specialities. Thank you, Panasonic. It was really nice to gather around the fireplace and share the ancient laws of the great algorithm. Of course, the reason to fly us up here was so we can film something interesting instead of our backyards. Unfortunately, we were very unlucky with the weather. Most of the time we had rain and storm, making it really hard to film something.
It peels your face right off.
Take that in account when you feel like judging me here. On the other hand, it will show how the S1RII performs under the worst conditions.
Let me address the elephant in the room. 8K? For video work, 6K is enough to have a little overhead for reframing and stabilization with 4K deliveries. 8K is not really an important feature. It is almost counterproductive. Higher cost for media and archives, less performance while editing, and usually a reduced sensitivity due to the smaller pixels. To my surprise, none of that really matters with the S1RII. At least it doesn't have to. The S1RII can record with a variety of resolutions using the full sensor readout with no penalty to sensitivity or dynamic range. Quite on the contrary, it only brings advantages like a reduced native ISO and improved low-light capability. And if that sounds counterintuitive, wait a minute, we get into it.
Before we go deeper into tech talk, let's start off with something creative to show the qualities of the camera and to get you excited. And that's why we visited our favorite location with our favorite actor, a rather dim place, and it's amazing that the S1RII can shoot 120 frames per second without a noticeable drop in quality. No noise reduction was applied. Of course, everything is shot on the Lumix S1RII with a 50mm Arles Cineprime, handheld and with active IBIS. For this part, we shot 10-bit 420 H.265 in various resolutions and speeds. You see those in the bottom left corner. Thank you, Maximilian Heinemann, for letting me torment you. At least you didn't have to die this time. Our Lynch and Kubrick members can download the action packs to play with the original S1RII footage. We included the resolved timelines with grade and a special RLUT. Members find the according link in the membership tab of our channel homepage. I'll put a link in the corner. Now that you got an idea what the S1RII can do, let's dive deeper. As you probably know, Panasonic has a strict don't ask, don't tell policy when it comes to sensor supplier and type. But a little bit of looking into the grapevine and comparing specs makes it quite obvious what beast we have here. Most probably the Sony IMX366. The Sony IMX366 is a new consumer-grade 45 megapixel sensor and basically the only 45 megapixel sensor that is open to the market. Basically, all 6K full-frame cameras in the market that use Sony sensors, like the Blackmagic 6K and the Pixies, the Nikon Z6, the Lumix S5 II, and many others are likely using the IMX410 sensor. The IMX410 was introduced in 2018, ancient by sensor standards. We use 2 cameras with an IMX410 for our shootout against the ARRI Alexa. I put a link in the corner if you're interested, and as you see here, you would have a hard time to tell which is the Alexa with a high-end cine lens and which is the Lumix S5 IIX with a kit zoom. The left one is a Lumix and it has a great bang for the buck, but with 7 years on its back, the sensor calls for an update. The Sony IMX366 is kind of the successor to the IMX410, but with a higher pixel count. Actually, at the release of this episode, no other product on the market uses the IMX366, which makes it extra interesting.
Cameras like the A7S III that have been on the market for a while use a higher megapixel sensor that is binned down. In the spec sheet of the IMX366, we can also read that it's a back-illuminated and not a stacked sensor. Why has Sony not used the 366 for their own lineup yet? Well, my guess is as good as yours. It might just not have fitted in the product life cycles yet. Let's look at the features that I deem most important to what this channel is about: filmmaking.
Like stated in the intro, the dynamic range claimed by Panasonic is 13 stops, and there's a feature called the extended dynamic range that can be switched on, and it's supposed to boost the dynamic range by 1 stop in the highlights to then 14 stops. Unlike the GH6 and GH7, this boost is not achieved by DZO, so by combining 2 different gain images in camera. Panasonic wasn't transparent in how this is achieved. The dual native ISO is much lower than what we are used to, with 200 and 1000 when filming without extended dynamic range and 400 and 2000 when filming with the extended dynamic range. Counterintuitively, this doesn't lead to a reduced low-light capability. High ISOs are just as good or even better compared to the higher native ISOs of the IMX410. The lower native ISO has the advantage that you can film without ND in much brighter conditions, without getting a dynamic range penalty. So why wouldn't you always want to keep the extended dynamic range function on? It does have a penalty in regards to the rolling shutter. We all know that more pixels in a larger sensor doesn't help with rolling shutter. The S1RII displays a noticeable jello effect when you really force it. Practically, I never had a problem with the rolling shutter of my full-frame IMX410 cameras like the S5 IIX. So how does the S1RII look in comparison? Looking at the S1RII and the S5 IIX side by side, the rolling shutter looks pretty identical. Oh, and if you think, how did you do these side-by-side shots with this monstrosity of a rig? It is heavy, and that's why those shots can be a bit shaky. When you switch on the extended dynamic range, things go south. When shooting handheld or with fast-moving subjects, you should definitely leave the extended dynamic range switched off. Like briefly mentioned in the sensor chapter, the S1RII has an improved sensitivity compared to the S5 IIX that already is great in low light. It can easily turn a dark gangway into a seemingly bright lit location, and that without introducing noticeable noise. This is filmed at 5000 ISO and f1.8, and no noise reduction is used. If we film this side by side with the S5 IIX, matching the settings, both cameras should deliver the same perceived brightness. But the S1RII looks considerably brighter. Even though the pixels of the S5 IIX are much bigger than those of the S1RII, the latter produces a cleaner and better image. If we push the images hard to reveal the noise floor, it gets even more shocking. While we clearly see a pattern and chroma noise in the S5 IIX image, the S1RII is virtually clean, meaning you can easily brighten the image in post.
I have worked with cameras like the Sony FX3 that are quite good in low light. It's about as good as the S5 IIX. The S1RII is not only better in low light, it is shockingly better. From all the cameras I ever worked with, the S1RII is hands down the best in the sensitivity department. This doesn't only help in dim ambient light, but also shooting high frame rates or with slower lenses like it wasn't possible before.
This is not a low light test. When we're talking about low light, we are usually talking about some good ambient light still being there. Here we were hunting for auroras, and to find them we had to drive with a bus for hours to be far away from the city light pollution and to find a hole in the clouds. All the light that illuminates this scene is moon and starlight. Well, and the screens from the cameras. It was so dark that you couldn't see much with your bare eyes. Barely enough not to run to somebody, but not enough to tell whether the silhouette next to you was a man or a woman or what color the jacket had. I was surprised what the S1RII was still able to get. Of course, we used long shutter and a fast lens with the Simera-C T1.5, but still, at ISO 10,000 the camera is way brighter than what your eye delivers, even showing colors. This is my iPhone Pro Max right next to the S1RII, and as you can see over my shoulder already, you see next to nothing on the display. This is what the phone actually filmed at the best settings, and this is what the S1RII got. Looking at the screen, I thought, what are these spotlights that you see in the bus door? And going closer, I realized those are just the tiny lights in the stairs, so you don't miss your step. Here, let me show you how this looks in log. I didn't even apply noise reduction in post. You do see the noise close up, but it's just so fine that it's swallowed by the oversampling in normal viewing conditions. The cars and trucks that drove by look quite surreal with lights so bright they would light up the whole scenery. Obviously, this is not how you would conduct a planned shooting, but it gives you an idea on how far you can push the S1RII. This is a Kelvin play, a tiny handlight that is not that bright, and boom! With these settings, it looks like a huge HMI. By the way, the red light you see here is from the night mode setting in the S1RII. When you're out in super dark conditions, you can set the whole menu and image to be displayed in dark red. This doesn't blind you when you look into the screen, just like in submarines during periscope use.
Yeah?
Can you label it?
Oh. No, it's clever. I love it.
If you can't light one thing, it is the sky. And this is about as bright as the sky looked to the bare eye. And here it is how it looks at ISO 10,000, with a bit of noise reduction. We're looking mostly at the constellation of Taurus, and what you see here coming out of the cloud is not a star, but Jupiter. The red giant Aldebaran is over here. We also see the Pleiades star cluster here. And here's the Hyades cluster that is suspected to harbor the closest black hole to Earth at a mere 150 light years. Scary. And talking about scary, here behind the clouds you can't see Uranus. No, really, it's right here. Let's go through the ISO to see how far you can push the sky. Again, we shot 24 frames per second at 360° shutter, and the lens is at t1.5. The S1RII can shoot video up to 30 frames per second in 8K, up to 60 frames per second in 5.9K, that is, from a full sensor readout, and up to 120 frames per second in 4K, again without cropping. With frame rates higher than 60, you will still get the full frame readout, so no crop, but the sensor has a maximum readout at 60 frames per second for full resolution. What you record in higher frame rates is some form of binning or skipping, so be a little aware of moires when pushing beyond 60 frames per second. Generally, the 4K in 120 frames per second looks great. What frame rate is possible in what quality and resolution depends on the codec. If neither turnaround speed or the ultimate quality is desired, the Lumix S1RII can record the usual 422 H.264 and 420 H.265 flavors. I will not bore you with numbers and long GOP versus all intra here, all that stays pretty much the same. Open gate modes have been announced with the S1RII, but with firmware 1.0 you can only record open gate at 5.8K downscaled from the full 8K sensor readout and in H.265, so the same as the S5IIX. With an upcoming firmware upgrade, the S1RII will get OpenGate in full resolution, and that will include ProRes and ProRes RAW. The S1RII can record ProRes and ProRes RAW up to 8K HQ at 30 frames per second internally. A RAW codec is by definition not debyered, so there are no internal scalings available. In RAW modes, the display shows pixel to pixel instead of the sensor portion that you used. You can choose lower resolutions, but those will always be a sensor crop. This limitation is not set for the ProRes flavors, and you get videos that are downscaled from the full 8K sensor readout. 120 frames per second can be recorded in ProRes, but only in Full HD. For a fast turnaround, the camera can generate proxies for select resolutions on the fly, and it will write those on the secondary SD card. If there's one thing I'm impressed with, it is the stabilization of the S1RII. The Dual S as well as the IBIS are improved and work without image crop or vignetting thanks to the wide L mount. I wouldn't go as far as to say that this replaces a real gimbal, but it's quite impressive with what you can get away with, walking, or making handheld slides, or making the camera look locked down. You can make pans that look so smooth that you would assume that the shot was made from a tripod with a fluid head. Additionally, you can activate E-stabilization, but I'm generally not a fan of that as it crops into the sensor. That is something one should do in post if possible. Of course, sensor stabilization has its disadvantages, and if you jerk it too hard, it will be visible in the shot. Of course, as a serious filmmaker, you want to pull focus manually to tell a story, and we did most of the time during our time in Tromsø. Still, it comes in very handy when vlogging or tracking a subject. Panasonic is not legendary for great autofocus, but the PDAF in the newer cams like the S25X is very decent, and with good light, it performs almost as good as professional tools like the DJI Focus Pro. In case you didn't know, you can use the DJI LiDAR on Lumix cameras, and it will use the servos of a native lenses directly. No motors or rigging, no calibration, especially in the dark, that offers improved autofocus as the PDAF relies on what the sensor sees instead of real distance measurements. I'll link a comparison in the corner. I strongly believe that an autofocus has to work with the default settings, so we left it right there. Running around town with Luca gave us the chance to test subject recognition.
We got amazing reindeer steak yesterday here. Yeah.
For the most part, continuous tracking of a person works sufficiently, but once in a while it loses subjects that appear quite clear.
Figure out the modes and everything. I'm in full manual here, and I'm just trying to figure out how the autofocus is, how exposure works. It's a bit fiddly for a start if you don't do anything.
I always like to have something in my episodes that is teaching the world things they probably never need. This is Roald Amundsen, and if you haven't know the name, he was the first guy to be on the South Pole. There's a famous race between him and a guy called Scott. There was a British guy, and they raced to be the first one on the South Pole. And he was the first one using sleds with dog sleds, and Scott used petrol-powered equipment, and it failed. And Scott actually froze to death, while Amundsen became a national hero of Norway. And I think we might be related. Actually, I have the same face like him. Or maybe it's just the f***ing cold. See ya.
I don't know if you noticed, but mid-video the autofocus switched from my face to the bust. I think the autofocus should realize that I'm the point of interest and not the giant in the back. As usual, we will probably see improvements with future firmware upgrades.
It's me again.
With the short time I had with the S1RII, it is absolutely normal to be a little overwhelmed by the ton of new features and modes. It took me a while back home to set the camera up properly, to decide what shooting modes I would put into custom modes, and it will take more time to develop the muscle memory you want to have on serious shootings. You are going to need the mechanical lock button on the camera to not constantly give undesired inputs. Thankfully, you can configure the lock button and almost everything else to your heart's desire. The tilt and free angle LCD is pretty sweet, and as far as built-in screens go, there are no obvious flaws. For serious shooting, you will want a cage and an external monitor, of course. Here is the S1RII inside an S5 II cage. One screw does not close, so it's not 100% the same. For a monitor, I can really recommend the Portkeys BM54. It's a high bright 5-inch monitor, and that size is just right for such a small camera. Batteries last reasonably long, and you have all the features you need and expect in a higher-end monitor. What most monitors in this bracket lack is a good menu. Most of the non-small HD monitors drive me crazy. Not so the BM54. It has Portkeys Synonym OS, and the touchscreens-driven menus are easy to understand and operate. Very nice. I had the Portkeys BM54 with me in Tromsø, and it allowed me to pull focus, reliable using the Simera-C lenses that I had with me too. A whole set of T1.5 cine lenses in the hand luggage. Try that with any other cine lens set. With a monitor, cine lenses and a follow focus, you can really use the S1RII like you want to in a narrative context. Autofocus just can't do this kind of storytelling using focus. While the native photo lenses are all fine, servo lenses are less than ideal for that job. As stated, firmware upgrades with 8K OpenGate flavors will come. When? The first rule of Lumix Club is that you don't talk about things like that. Same is true for RE-Log-C that you find in the GH7, so that might be something we can hope for in a future upgrade. I was complaining a bit that proxies don't work with all codecs, especially the OpenGate modes where you need them the most, and they said that that should be possible. Of course, I asked the Panasonic reps if there's a plan for an S1H2. And you guessed it, Lumix Club. I wouldn't really know what video features they would put in a video-centric version that you don't find in the S1RII already. Besides, maybe higher frame rates. It seems very unlikely that Panasonic would use another sensor in that model, but the specs of the IMX366 show that the sensor can be read out at 60 frames per second. Not a lot of a benefit though.
Like I already said in the intro, if you're looking for a real all-rounder with exceptional video capabilities, the S1RII leaves little to desire. It's light and small if you need to travel, and it still delivers the best quality photos and videos that you can possibly expect out of a camera in this context. Perfect for creators, photographers, and filmmakers.
All the limitations you had to deal with when working with the S5 II are pretty much gone. Everything you loved about the S1 and S1H is in the S1RII, just improved. And OpenGate ProRes RAW HQ will finally give you what you always lacked in this form factor. A real digital negative for film that gives even higher-end cameras a run for the money in terms of sheer image quality. Don't you wish that DaVinci Resolve would support it? Grant, please. I know you have your political reasons not to support ProRes RAW, but you would really do a lot of filmmakers a great favor. Until Grant has his awakening, we Resolve users will have to stay with ProRes. But 422 ProRes HQ is not too shabby at all. Most of our high-end shootings use ProRes. The stabilization is fantastic. I really dig the lower native ISO that makes the camera way more flexible without ND. If you need higher ISO, you can still go with 2000 or 4000 without penalty, and you can just pull up from there. The low light is really something for an 8K camera. I dare to call it a no-light camera. Not that you want to do that in a narrative context, but you can use the S1RII for night vision like nothing I've used before.
Of course, it is way too early to give you a sophisticated verdict. We just had this camera for a week, and there's so much more to learn and to discover. Of course, we want to try the S1R2 beyond her function as a vlogging and creator tool. We definitely want to bring her into a more professional situation and see how she does there. But for now, there was just no time to explore the possibilities any further. If you are interested in what we can pull out of the S1R2 in the future, please subscribe. Besides, we always have a ton of interesting things about the tech, the gear, the art and the craft of filmmaking. How about you continue with our latest epic episode, The Magic Sauce, where we explore about every ingredient that goes into creating real movie magic yourself. Lighting is certainly very important, but what are the other ingredients in the magic sauce? Watch the screen, little starling. Until next time, I'm Nicholas, signing out with nerdylicious wishes. Shoot something amazing.